Guys, here's the deal. Today, we're going to jump right in because we're going to do something we have not done for several years around here, and that is we're going to do a little tag team speaking. So I'm actually going to share the talk today with Jason, who oversees our middle school and high school students. Pretty cool that Easter Sunday, Sunday morning, 9 and 10:30 a.m., we're actually going to two services every single week for our middle school. Right now, it's only been at 10:30, but now we're moving to 9 and 10:30 starting on Easter Sunday. By the way, if you have no idea what tag team speaking is, don't worry about it. All right, it's kind of like tag team wrestling, but I got to tell you, we are not the Road Warriors, we are not the Rock and Roll Express, and we are not the Dudley Boys. Okay, we are Team Great Lakes, and so we're going to have some fun. Here's what's going to deal. Here's the deal. I'm going to start the talk. Pastor Jason's going to come, and he's going to do the middle of the talk, and then I'm going to come and wrap it up, and I'll correct any bad theology he tried to teach, all right? And so this 2-week series called Famous Last Words, the premise of the series is that words matter. Whether they were spoken decades ago or if they were spoken as the final words on our time here on this planet. All right, words matter. Back in 2011, I remember my realtor giving me a call and said, hey, that house you really, really liked and really, really wanted, guess what? They took your offer. And it was like, yes, right? We were super excited, so those were fun words to hear. Words can be discouraging. They can be life-giving. They can also bring death into a room, depends on what's being spoken, right? They can make someone happy or sad. Words, if they're used in the right way, can actually confuse people too, right? There's actually a homeowner who lives up by the Milwaukee airport, and back in the 70s, he painted a sign on the roof of his house. It says, "Welcome to Cleveland." All right, he painted this just to mess with people flying into Milwaukee airport. But words matter. And they can be used to offend people if they're used in a certain way. In fact, at Loyola University in Chicago this past week, a comedian told a rape joke, had the mic cut off, and music started to play because the university was saying, we are not going to put up with that. All right, so words matter. And last week, what we did is we looked at some of the final words of Jesus spoken on the cross. When he said, Father, I entrust my spirit into your hands. Words of surrender, words of trust, and we talked about how do we develop that in our life. Well, today what we're going to do is look at other words spoken by Jesus on the cross, apparently his final words. And the reason we even know what he spoke on the cross is because people took the time to record it, and they took the time to write it down. One of the people who recorded the final words of Jesus is his disciple John, a guy who'd been with him for 3 years, learning from him, looking to him for direction. And here is what he wrote that Jesus said on the final moments on the cross. Jesus said, it is finished. Then he bowed his head and released his spirit. It is finished. Now think about those words for just a moment. Because if we could sit down with some of the brightest people who've ever lived, if we could sit down with people who've accomplished more than almost anybody who's ever lived, if we could sit down and talk to some of the most successful people in the history of the world, and we could talk to them right before they breathe their final breath, I promise you almost every single one of them, if not every single one of them, would say, I've got so much more than I want to accomplish. Whether it's Albert Einstein in all of his being able calculations, or Thomas Edison and all the great inventions he still had in his mind. Steve Jobs, certainly when he died, still had more products that he wanted to introduce to the world. One of the greatest artists who've ever walked the face of this earth is Michelangelo. This guy was a legend. He lived in the 1500s, and he accomplished a whole lot of stuff. The Sistine Chapel, he decided that he was going to paint that, and to this day, hundreds of years later, 5 million people go and visit the Sistine Chapel every year. The Statue of David, right? He carved this when he was just 29 years old. It's 17 feet tall. I'd like to show you a whole picture of it, but I decided to keep it clean today. All right, when he was just 24, he carved out the Pieta. Okay, this is a single piece of marble that he carved this out of. This is actually what put Michelangelo on the map. But when he died, this is hard to believe, he actually had way more finished way more unfinished pieces of work than he actually had finished pieces of work. Way more unfinished masterpieces than completed masterpieces. So this is fascinating that Jesus, while hanging on the cross in his early to mid-30s, would shout out these words, "It is finished. It's complete." He had fulfilled his reason for being here. Jesus had come to planet Earth to show us God's love, to save and rescue us from the power of sin, to set up God's kingdom, and ultimately to shut down religion. That was his purpose. And it's on the cross where he said, "It's finished," which is why for the past 2,000 years, followers of Jesus have attached themselves and they've identified themselves with a simple sign and a symbol of their faith, and it is the cross. That's it. That's their symbol. It's the cross. And it's interesting because we think of the cross sometimes maybe as a religious symbol, but in reality, it's a symbol of torture and of execution. That's how Romans executed criminals. They used the cross. So for someone to say, "I identify with the cross," would quite honestly be like We Energies today saying, "We're going to use the electric chair as our logo," right? Energy you can depend on. That's kind of morbid. But we don't think of the cross as morbid. We think of it as this beautiful piece of jewelry. We think of it as part of our pop culture, right? Because every day on the news or in different magazines, we see celebrities wearing crosses around their neck. And they're not necessarily making a faith statement. They're not making some religious statement. What they're doing is they're just wearing a piece of jewelry. Back in 2006, some of you are going to remember Rolling Stone magazine featured Kanye West on their cover, and he's wearing a crown of thorns and a tunic, and they titled the cover, "The Passion of Kanye West," somehow connecting him with Jesus. Madonna, a decade ago, during her Confessions tour, which brought in $193 million, at the end of each performance, she went through this mock crucifixion in which she was crucified on a disco cross. And what's interesting is she got some negative publicity and some negative feedback from religious people. And so she just justified it. She said, "Hey, if Jesus was here today and he was alive, he would do the same thing." Which I'd give a little bit of pushback to the idea that Jesus would go on tour through a mock crucifixion on a disco cross, bringing in $193 million. I don't know if that exactly is what Jesus would do. But we're so used to seeing the cross, and it's such a part of our pop culture that we forget the shock and we forget the drama and the horror behind it. In fact, C.S. Lewis, who's a well-known author and a Christian thinker, here's what he writes about the crucifixion. He said, "Crucifixion did not become common in art until all who had seen a real one died off." See, the cross is not a sign of winning. It's a sign of losing. It's not a sign of abundance. It's a sign of poverty and loss. It's not a status symbol. It's actually a expression of humiliation. And so it's on the cross that Jesus, in his final moments, shouts these words, "It is finished. I've completed the work that I've come to do." And so Pastor Jason is going to come, and he's going to walk us through the different stages of the crucifixion. And I'm telling you, you're going to have to tune in because some of this is going to be so foreign. It's like, wow, I never knew that happened. And it's pretty intense. It's pretty serious. If he gives you any bad teaching, I'll come back later and correct it. So Jason, don't screw this up.
That's still yours.
That's still my mic. I screwed it up. I handed him a mic and I didn't need to.
That's quite the introduction.
Bye.
What do we even need him for? All right, so as Dave said, my name is Jason, and I am the new middle school and high school pastor here at the Kenosha campus. And I got to tell you, there's no better way to introduce me than the lighthearted topic of the torture and death of Jesus. Now, I promise you, typically, I'm a pretty lighthearted guy. I like to have fun. If you have middle schoolers or senior hires or you know of any, please tell them not all of our talks are going to sound like Mortal Kombat, but tonight just might. As Dave said, the cross has become such a common thing in our occurrence. It's everywhere across pop culture. We see it. Some of you may have it in your home. Some of you may have it on a bumper sticker. We see it everywhere. As a matter of fact, this is a picture of my family and I. This is my wife, Ashton, and our daughter, Rory, and she's 3. And I remember when she was born, well, honestly, I don't remember a lot about that night. There's a lot of stress, a lot of screaming. I took a nap in the middle of it. True story. And then we had a kid. But in the days afterwards, we were in the hospital, and come to find out, at that hospital, there are crosses on the inside and outside of every door, and at the beginning and end of every hallway. There's got to be like 10,000 crosses in that hospital, and I didn't even notice, to be honest with you. Again, there's a lot going on, but I didn't even notice until a couple friends came to visit us, and you know when adult males visit babies, they don't know what to do. So instead, we pointed out the crosses, and the first thing we did, I got to be honest, we made fun of it. How many babies do you think that all these crosses cost? How many crosses did your baby just buy them? Do you get to keep the cross, or does it stay there? And for the money I paid, I hope I got to keep it. But I didn't even notice. That's how much of a background noise the cross has become. But it's weird that that's happened to us today, because in ancient times and in biblical times, nobody walked by a cross. It wasn't background noise. It was a huge deal. It was something that everybody drew attention to, and this is because the Romans were very good at killing people. It was something they specialized in. They had all types of different ways of killing criminals and taking their cost from them. And most of them had something in common. The majority of them were cheap, efficient, and public. Cheap, efficient, and public. Burnings, stonings, swords, they were all efficient, cheap, and public. But they also had a whole other catalog of deaths. They learned from the Greeks about 300 years earlier how to kill somebody in private. The philosopher Socrates, when he was killed, was actually forced to drink poison, to drink hemlock in a small ceremony amongst his friends and families. It was very much like Hunger Games. And at the end of that time, he was dead, and they let them have that. So the Romans saw that, and they added that to the catalog. So with all these options that were cheaper and more efficient and more public, why would they add crucifixion? Why would they focus on crucifixion? And really, the whole ordeal took tons of man-hour and time and cost. So why would they do that? And we look back and we find out that they introduced crucifixion for 2 reasons. When they wanted the criminal to experience maximum pain and maximum humiliation. That was what they were interested in those moments, maximum pain and maximum humiliation. In fact, when the warrior Spartacus, who looked like this apparently, he was a built young man and apparently worked part-time as a warrior and part-time as an Abercrombie model. When he and 6,000 of his closest soldiers were captured and they lost their rebellion, the Romans set up a masterpiece of brutality. They crucified 6,000 people end to end in one day. If we did that today from our front door here, it would stretch all the way down I-94 to Madison. And they put in all that work and all that time and all that money for one reason, to say, don't mess with us. Because the crucifixion was about maximum humiliation and maximum pain. See, crucifixion didn't just start at the cross. It wasn't just that. It started with a trial and a condemnation, and then from then, they started in with the process. So phase 1 of a Roman crucifixion actually began with a beating. And this beating was beautifully brutal. And Jesus went through it as a condemned criminal. It started with a beating using something called a cat of nine tails, which was leather straps and small pieces of clay and small pieces of glass put on the end of it. And this was a brutal weapon because it would take soldiers upon soldiers to administer a beating, where with each stroke of that whip, with each lash, there were actually 2 wounds dealt. The first one, when it came down, those pieces would dig into your flesh, but then they would settle in, and they would let them take their hold. And then they would rip it out. So each time was 2 different wounds. And that was so bad that there had to be an experienced soldier administering the beating, because if it took 1 or 2 too many strikes, the criminal would die long before the cross. I mean, John, a follower of Jesus, he put it this way in John 19. He said, "Then Pilate had Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip. The soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put a purple robe on him. 'Hail, King of the Jews,' they mocked as they slapped him across the face." Maximum pain, maximum humiliation. The cost of that man feeling his crime was the only goal. So then they would go for public humiliation. They would take the criminal after being beaten within an inch of his life, and they would put the crossbeam of the cross around their shoulders, and they would take them on a parade through the most crowded route, the most crowded section of town, where everybody stopped and stared because they knew what was going on. And as if that wasn't bad enough, one of those soldiers would walk out in front with a big sign that had written on it the crime that they had committed. And with each step, they would scream that crime again. So these criminals, Jesus, already beaten, already bruised, are now walking down the center of town, hearing their crime step after step, only being outmatched by their heartbeat in their head. And that was maximum humiliation. Imagine if we wanted to force this on one of you, which we won't, it's okay. But imagine we beat you. We forced you to walk naked and beaten down Milwaukee rush hour, just stuck between cars as they stopped and stared. That would be absolutely humiliating. But let's crank it up here. Let's make it hotter. And let's say we did the exact same thing. We made you walk down Summerfest. Now, I haven't been to Summerfest, but I hear it is crowded and it is busy. As a matter of fact, my hometown didn't have Summerfest, but yes, we had a festival. It was Bagel Fest. I'm not even kidding you. We had a festival of bagels. That is the world's largest bagel, which they somehow did every year. So this is what we came from. I wouldn't want to walk through Bagel Fest probably, period, but much less having been beaten and bruised and naked. I mean, put yourself in the mind of that person. They were absolutely humiliated. And then came phase 2, where they would reach the place of their execution, and they would be put onto the cross beam and support bar, and they would have their hands tied or nailed to that cross. And we know Jesus' hands were nailed. They took 4 to 9-inch nails, not the band, and they drove them into the body of the criminal. They would stretch out their arms, and they would put nails through their wrists, and they would stack their feet, and they would put nails through the ankle. And then finally, almost, they would raise him up into the crucifixion pose. And it was absolutely painful. I can't even imagine how painful that would have been. As a matter of fact, my most painful moment in life, I gotta be honest with you, it was when I was 12. I am a chicken, so I do not do a lot of things that take risk. But when I was 12, I was super into X Games, and I thought I was gonna be the next gold medal rollerblader. So we sat out one afternoon, my friends and I, and we went to a playground, not a skate park, but a playground. And I climbed up to the top of the highest slide. It must have been 15, 20, 175 feet. And I climbed up on top of it, and I went, this is it. This is where my career begins. And I took my leap of faith. And on the way down, I screamed the name of some trick that I can promise you my body was not successfully doing. And I landed in a crumpled mass on the ground. And I thought I was dead. I start screaming, I start wailing, I start crying. I'm not ashamed to admit it. And my friends came, and I made them drag me the 2 blocks back to my house. As I screamed, and I said, why, Jesus, why? Why would you do this to me? This is your fault. I get home, and my mom meets us at the front door, having heard my cries of desperation for the last block. And she's freaked out, and she looks at me, and she goes, yep. You sprained your ankle. That's it. But in that moment, I thought it was over. I thought that was it. I can't even imagine, compared to that, what the pain Jesus was going through. And then it became this almost inner war while they were on the cross between breathing and pain. Because the Romans were scientists when they came to this torture. And they would put their hands and their legs a little bit flexed because it lasted longer. And in those moments, that criminal had to choose between pain and breath. Because if they wanted to breathe, their chest was pulled tight by their arms. And they would have to push up off their feet to even gasp in a full breath. And when that pain of the nails moving in their feet and in their hands became too much, they would collapse back down. And this battle between breath and pain, survival and death, would ultimately be won by death. But not immediately. Sometimes hours, sometimes days. Now, I gotta be honest, I would have been crying for my long before that point. My mommy would have had to have saved me. But that's Roman crucifixion in a nutshell. That's what Jesus went through. It is so just brutal, so dangerous, that the Romans actually made a law where if you were a Roman citizen, regardless of what you did, they would not crucify you. And I don't know a lot of governments that say we have come up with something so diabolical that we would not let our own people feel it. But they did, even back then. Only foreigners and only slaves. Now, the crucifixion of Jesus was not very different from a physical standpoint, but it was entirely different on an emotional and on a spiritual standpoint, which is really where we're getting to today. See, Jesus was experiencing a realm of spiritual suffering that we can only try to understand. The Apostle Paul in the first century put it this way. He said, "For God made Christ, who never sinned, to be the offering for our sin, so that we could be made right with God through Christ." On that cross, Jesus, who knew no sin, who never experienced guilt, who never had a moment of regret in his life, who never hurt the heart of God, who had earned none of it. In that moment, he took it all. He who knew no sin, who had earned no punishment, became sin for you, became sin for me, for our sake. I mean, take a second here and think about the deepest, most darkest moment of your life. That thing that you wish you could go back and undo. That thing that sneaks into your mind when you're trying to fall asleep and it's already been a long night. That thing that not even your best friend or your spouse knows. And now turn to the person to your left and share it. No, this is not that type of a group. Not that type of thing. But that's what he took. But not just that, not all of our highlights. He also took the small things, every bit of jealousy, every bit of frustration, every road rage, every lie, every cheat, every scam. He took it all. He took all of your sins. He took all of Pastor Dave's sins. He took even my 2 or 3 sins. And in that moment, he bore them all. And then add to that every sin that's ever been committed across all time. Every murder, every abuse, every seduction, every betrayal, every deception, every genocide. All of it came onto his shoulders when he had earned none. If I can be honest for a second, one thing that has always bothered me, one thing that has always questioned me is, why did Jesus have to die on the cross? Why was it even necessary? Why did that have to be the thing? Why couldn't he have done what you and I do every single day? Why couldn't God have done what you and I do every single day and look at the people that hurt us and say, you know what? We're good. I forgive you. Why couldn't God do that? Why did Jesus have to die? I mean, I do that all the time, and sometimes I even mean it. So why couldn't God? Now, when I ask myself this, I grew up in church, so I have the Sunday school answer in my back pocket. I remember it from like 2nd or 3rd grade, where the only thing I remember is that Miss Janice had the best homemade popcorn. And I remember that the cost of sin is death, and somebody has to pay that cost, and it better not be me, so it was Jesus. And that through him, I can get to heaven and I can understand God. And I got that. It's good. But as I grow and as my faith grows, I start wondering, why did God even set up a system that had a cost to it at all? Why did God set up this game where somebody had to suffer? I mean, here's the thing. In other words, he's God. He can do anything he wants to. Why wouldn't he just change the rules here? It's like this. Right now, my daughter is super into playing hide and seek, which is a very aggressive game in a 2-bedroom apartment. There are like 4 places to hide. But we play almost every day. And I turn around and I count and I give her like 10 really good Mississippis. I'm fair. And sometimes I turn around and I am shocked that she is not there and we are actually playing. But more times than not, I turn around and she's sitting there just smiling at me or covering her eyes. And I go, all right, what do I do now? I could tag her. I could claim myself family hide and go seek champion of the world. But in those moments, I bend the rules and I say, no, go hide. And then I count again. If I'm willing to do that with hide and seek, a thing of no consequence, why couldn't God do that with a thing of ultimate consequence? Why did Jesus have to die on the cross? If you believe the Bible, it almost seems like God locked himself into a little bit of a box here, a problem that he can't solve. He's sort of a victim of his own making. Why can't the God of creation just say, I forgive you? Why did Jesus have to die? And obviously, this is a loaded question. It's one that causes us problems when we think about it too long, and we sometimes just want to shove it under the rug and not come back to it. But I think if we look at some of the ancient texts that we call the Bible, we can find an answer. Paul in the 1st century wrote a large book, a large letter to the Romans, and in chapter 3 he wrote this. For God presented Jesus as a sacrifice for sin. God did this to demonstrate his righteousness, for he himself is fair and just. Remember that. And he declares sinners to be right in his sight when they believe in Jesus. Why did Jesus have to die on the cross? Because God is both fair and just. Because God is both fair and just. The reason I had to die is because God is justice, and something has to be made right. Pure justice won't let somebody off the hook. In a system built on only what is right and wrong, when wrongs are made, somebody has to be made right. And God is just. I mean, this is something that we don't necessarily understand. We struggle with this, right? I mean, I let people off the hook all the time. You let people off the hook, but we're not pure justice. Actually, when we see justice being betrayed, we get upset. There was a judge in California recently who began handing out lenient sentences on his cases and offering more mercy than justice. And columns were written and blogs were put out as people were upset that somebody was supposed to represent what was just began acting with what was mercy. See, we understand this when it comes to our world, but we struggle with it when it comes to God. The truth is, you and I can let people off the hook, but God, by his nature, cannot. Every day God says to us, in my mercy, I'm going to overlook this sin for a while. I'm going to let this go for just a bit. I'm going to let you figure it out. But because I'm just, eventually something will have to be paid. Because I am right, something will have to be made right. And then he lets us figure it out. But here's the thing. God hates sin. Not just because it hurts him, but because it hurts us. God hates sin because we end up bruising and beating up ourselves more often than other people. God hates sin, but he loves you more. God despises sin, but he chose you and I instead of that. Our Heavenly Father is so committed to justice. He's so committed to wrongs being paid for sin being dealt with, that he sent his Son, Jesus, to make sure that it was all taken care of. And in that moment, when Jesus said those words, God was right behind him, saying, I am a God of mercy and justice and grace, all at once. All at one time. God says, in my mercy, I'm going to let this go for a while so that you and I don't die the moment that we lie. But he also says, in his justice, eventually this has to be made right. But he also says, in my grace, I'm going to let my Son pay it for you. The cross shows us God's love. And it's the ultimate expression of love. It's not just momentarily twisting the rules of hide and seek so that we can keep playing. It is him rewriting the script entirely and giving us a line of credit that we can never earn on our own. John, one of the followers of Jesus, wrote this in a letter later in his life. He said, this is real love. Not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as a sacrifice to take away our sins. When Jesus said, it is finished, when he said his famous last words, he wasn't just saying what he came to do then was finished. He wasn't just saying his death was finished. He was saying his entire purpose was finished. And in that moment, he showed us exactly who God is and showed us a whole new version of God. And this was important because back then there were hundreds, if not thousands of gods. So when people would say God, God, people didn't really understand what it meant. And this is really appropriate for us today because a lot of us have questions about who God really is. Is he the God that's conquering and seems angry? Is he the God that's loving and just wants me to have a great life? Is he a God that wants me to be better? Is he a God that wants to just let me be good? And when we answer all those questions at once, the answer is yes. And honestly, that's confusing. But in those moments when we get confused as to who God is, we have the advantage of looking to one man, Jesus. When he sat on that cross and said, it is finished, he was revealing everything that was left to be revealed about God. That yes, he is just, and there must be repayment for the things we do wrong. But yes, he is also graceful, and he will show us mercy by letting his Son pay the price for us. In that moment, it was finished. Dave's going to come back out now, and he's going to take us the rest of the way.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. In my mercy, I can let it go for a little while. In my justice, somebody has to pay. And in my grace, Jesus will pay for you. Now, if you hear that and you're like, I don't know. I'm really skeptical of that. It just seems so harsh. I get it. All right, because I was thinking this week, and after hearing Jason walk through the crucifixion earlier in the week when I was working with him on the talk, I was just like, man, if I'm honest, and this is going to sound, oh, Dave, you're so angelic. You've got a halo on your head. Okay, if I'm honest and I look at like the worst things I've ever done, okay, if I would have got caught for everything I've ever done, I would have got detention, gone to the principal's office. My parents would have spanked me more. In fact, they knew of everything I did. They'd get up here tonight and spank me. Like, whoa, that's awkward, right? Man, literally, I would have gotten tickets from the police, but I honestly don't think I would have even spent a night in jail. And yet here's God, and apparently God's saying, in my justice, somebody has to pay. Right? And then at what age does that start? At what age is it like, oh, like you sinned, you did wrong? So I'm thinking of this little kid, Mason, who in Florida recently, he wanted a toy from one of those arcade games, you know, where the claw goes down. And I'm guessing he was probably at the age, maybe 4 or 5 years old, that he was old enough to understand, like, you have to win that. But he wanted to bypass the system. So he literally climbs into the arcade, all right? They had to call the police to come and the fire guys out to come and rescue the kid. Now you're telling me this cute little Mason, like at some level, like, come on, that makes God mad? Well, I'm not saying it makes God mad. What I am saying is that our sin does separate us from God. Our sin does put a gap, a wedge between us and him. And his sin is not necessarily some action that we do. It's not like you went out and you sinned, it was wrongdoing. Sin is the condition of the human heart. And I think the reason this is so difficult for us to understand is because we underestimate the significance of our condition. Right? We underestimate the significance of sin. See, when I look at my sin, quite honestly, I just look at it in the context of your sin. I'm like, I know I'm good. I know what those people did, right? But again, God looks at it as a condition, and he looks at my sin in the context of who he is, his holiness, his perfection, his greatness. So this little bitty, drop in the bucket sin that I'd be like, come on, yeah, I didn't forgive them. Yeah, I was harsh on them. Yeah, I lied. Yeah. God says, I look at that in the context of my holiness. And that's what makes it so difficult for you to sync up with me. That's what makes it so difficult. That's why sin separates. Now, when I'm guessing 4 years old, okay, because my brother Todd's a year younger than me. He was 3 years old. My dad had just done a remodel at our home in Kenosha, 42nd Street and Sheridan Road, and he had put in brand new, I want to say oak cabinets, and for the countertop, he put in laminate countertops. Okay, so brand new, just went through this whole remodel. Like the day or the next day, my brother Todd, 3 years old, decides he's going to help my dad, so he takes a hammer and he just whacks the countertop. So, of course, it chips this brand new laminate. Now, what does my dad say? What does he do at this point? He looks at a 3-year-old, right? How can he effectively communicate what just happened? Like, this is going to take hours and hours of time to fix. It's going to take hundreds and hundreds of dollars if we decide to fix it. And then, hey, Todd, you have to pay for this. Right? Todd didn't have any money from birthday cards at 3 years old. He didn't have anything, that he could, chores that he could do to pay it back. And so what did my dad have to do? I'm like, Todd, put the hammer down. Thanks for trying to help me, but that's not helping. Don't do that again. And Todd's like, yes, sir, Daddy, right? That's about all that could happen. And I think in the context of our sin, it's just us. Like we took the hammer, we just chipped a little bit of countertop, and there's no way for us to understand the significance. And so I think God just says, how do I illustrate it? How do I help people understand their condition? And how do I even ask them to pay? I really can't ask them to pay because even if I wanted them to pay, they couldn't pay anyways. Right? It's like trying to explain to a group of toddlers the quantum theory of energy. How do you explain to people in our world the holiness and the purity and the greatness of God? We can think as big as we want to think, and we can think as large as we want to think. But the truth is, we're humans. And we don't understand the human condition. We don't understand how all of this works. It's mysterious. Right? We don't understand how different our nature is from the nature of God. And so this condition, this sinful condition, this natural gravitation to do what is wrong, God says, because I'm fair and because I'm just, I'm perfect justice, somebody has to pay. And that's why we have the cross. The cross is this symbol. It is this picture of how big of a deal sin really is. Such a big deal, somebody has to pay. And at the same time, it is a picture of the mercy of God and the grace of God. It's God's way of communicating to this world that sin doesn't have to separate, that it can be forgiven once and for all. And that's the reason why 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Paul writes these words to followers of Jesus. He writes this about God. He said, he canceled the record of the charges against us and took it away by nailing it to the cross. So here's the deal. You can spend the rest of your life trying to do the right things and behave the right way and say, God, I want to make you happy. And at the end of the day, you can go through the motions, but you'll never be able to pay based on your behavior. You'll never be able to pay what truly is owed as a result of our condition. But that's okay, because Jesus paid it for us. That's why at the cross, he said, it is finished. There is a freedom that comes when we understand that we don't have to earn our way into God's favor, that we don't have to behave our way into God's favor, that he just accepts us as is. I regularly up here will share stories of my life and my brokenness and kind of where my marriage is at times when things aren't going well. And people say, well, Dave, that's got to be super difficult for you to share that stuff. You're just kind of this open book. And I tell them all the time, it's not that hard. You know why? Because I have a confidence in who Jesus is. That's why. Like, I find freedom in who Jesus is. I don't feel like I got to behave my way in his grace, pretend my way in his grace. So if you're always pretending, if you're always kind of hiding and hoping nobody finds out about your secret sins, if you're always racked with some sort of shame in your life, I'm telling you, you don't understand the cross. Because at the cross, we see the mercy of God, the justice of God, but ultimately, we see the grace of God. And when it comes to the forgiveness of sins, Jesus said, once and for all, it is finished. So the only thing you and I need to do is embrace it. And as we embrace it and we receive it into our lives, certainly we can start behaving and making better choices. But ultimately, at the end of the day, when we make the wrong choice and when we do things that would hurt us or hurt the heart of God, he says, you're still forgiven. You live in a state of forgiveness because it is finished. It's done. It's complete. So my hope is that as we go through the rest of our week and we go through the days leading up to Easter, that we would keep this in the forefront of our mind. Not just the back of our mind, but the forefront of our mind, that we live in a state of forgiveness, that Jesus said, it is finished, and there's nothing I need to do to try to earn God's favor. Yeah, I'm screwed up, but guess what? In his eyes, I'm perfect. Yeah, I dropped the ball. Yes, I failed, but in his eyes, I'm not a failure. He sees me through the lens of the cross. And so let's keep that at the forefront of our mind. If you haven't ever watched The Passion of the Christ, I'm going to encourage you this season, man, do it. Be reminded of the significance of what Jesus went through and why it matters. Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, I thank you for the cross. We gather together week after week after week to celebrate and to honor and to worship Jesus. I pray that on the weeks that we don't necessarily mention the cross by name, that it would be central and core still to everything we do around here, to who we are and why we exist. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.